So rather than jumping into a particular topic right off the bat, because I think some people have different areas of interest. So I was hoping at the end we could actually discuss where to go from here. I thought a nice general survey of, well, life and death in the scriptures would be helpful to situate us so that we can go forward from here. So what is life? What is death? All those very light questions that we have very definite answers for, of course. Well, at least with the Bible, the scriptures that govern it tend to be few and far between, unfortunately, because this isn't necessarily the major area of concern, because if we're talking about life and death, well, the main focus of the scriptures will be new life rather than the bare bones, what is the substance of life, if we can even say substance. Yeah, so I thought this might be good for getting our feet wet, and this will give us good context for when we actually delve into the issues at hand. Because when we're talking about, say, in abortion, what constitutes a human life, this might be useful for us to go, well, the bare bones of life is this is fundamentally what a human being is, so we can have some idea there. And if we're going to say the subject of euthanasia, you can say, well, what is death? Because euthanasia literally is a good death. So is death, or can death actually be good? So again, we'll add towards the end, I mentioned try and discuss where we want to go from here. Sorry, Deborah, were you going to say something?
Define euthanasia as a good death.
Well, no, that's literally the meaning of the word.
Of the word.
Yeah.
Right. You define. I thought we were going to talk about medically assisted.
Yeah, that will be part of euthanasia.
Like euthanasia, I don't think a medically assisted in death is a good death.
Yes, and that's going to be one of the things we're going to be talking about with it, because the general idea is that with any assisted suicide, whether it be medical or otherwise, it is talked about as euthanasia. Again, literally good death. So this is the better way of dying than would otherwise be if you didn't have assistance. That's the general idea why they use the term. So when we're talking about medically assisted suicide or medical assistance in dying, which is the main program in Canada, we'll be also discussing, well, can you actually have a good death in this sense? Yeah.
Well, and the other concern, you call euthanasia as opposed to natural death?
Yeah, that's okay. How the term's used.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Because a lot of these will be philosophical.
I just don't want to spend 6 weeks going over abortion.
Okay, no, I don't think we're probably not going to do that.
If that's what the topic is.
I do know that you're interested in abortion, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. But I'm not going to make it 6 whole weeks. I don't think there's justification for that, especially when I broaden the topic out to end of life issues, which would include abortion, euthanasia or assisted suicide, suicide in general, if you want to talk about suicide. And we could even talk about consolation in dying, if you really wanted to. If people are being confronted with their own death, this is an end of life issue. But if you just want to focus on a couple of particular topics, that's okay too. Right. Is there anything else? No? Okay. So first off, we should go to where it all begins to try and get our bearings. And this will be, well, creation. And when I was actually composing this and trying to look through the actual doctrine itself, well, I was finding it to be quite broad throughout all the scriptures. So the handout that I gave you should handedly give you the actual scriptures available, at least the narrow focus that I'll have. So Genesis 2:7 is just one verse. If you want more context, you can turn to the chapter. For that particular one, there's not too much else in context that you would really need. But with some of the other ones, a little bit of context could also help if you want to do that. So Genesis 2:7, it sounds simple, but it's actually fairly complex. So, then the Lord God formed man, depending on how you want to translate that. This is the NIV. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Yes.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I saw this particular verse used to defend abortion because
Really?
the baby's not alive unless it's breathing.
Ah,
Okay.
So so I looked it up because I saw it and I thought, and I said, well, unless the baby was made first of clay and not came from a womb,
Pretty
it's
much.
totally different. But yeah, they were using it as a defense.
yeah, there's not really much of a defense that you can use for that.
Are we going to distinguish between how God made man as opposed to how we make babies?
Oh.
I think you have to in this case.
In this case, I think it would be useful.
Yeah, exactly, because this is how God made man. That's
Yes,
not how we make babies.
right. And that's
Yeah.
obvious to anybody, but the fact that somebody used that as a reason that only a baby's only a human when it's breathing. It's just.
Yeah, well, that's
And
also,
citing this verse as proof, that's not yet.
It happened only once.
That's right. It was one verse. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
this is only how-
Yeah. although I'll even say how the NIV just says a man, that's also kind of an odd way to put it, because the man, Adam, that's not exactly a proper name. It's just the general term for man, or as it's used throughout the rest of the Old Testament, humanity. So it's mankind more specifically. So in Adam, we are all one in the sense that we all share in the same flesh. There is actually debates, theological debates, whether or not the soul the spirit, I should say, the spirit that we have is actually shared in Adam and Eve's spirit given to us through the family line, or if this is completely made new for each individual. This is a debate, yes. But it shows just how important certain traditions within the Christian church view Adam in the sense of he is the father of us all. Physically, if not also in some sort of spiritual sense.
There's a difference between the one-time act of creating Adam and everybody else who came later.
Yep.
So whether or not we got the Spirit is different than when Adam got the Spirit.
Yeah. So
So are we going to make a distinction between creating Adam as opposed to humanity, or how babies are made, or the gift of the Spirit to Adam and then we inherited that Spirit? Are we
We
making
can.
a distinction? But how? Okay. I know,
But I was trying to-
but how exactly they use this to defend abortion.
yeah. Well, I was going to try and narrow this down to just, well, what is a human being? Because this one verse actually gives us everything that we need to actually say what is a human being. And the abuse of the verse to say, well, you have to be breathing, is just one of the ways that this can actually be misunderstood. So if we're looking at this, saying, well, God formed a man from the dust, because God literally formed us Well, Psalm 139 would say that yes, he does shape us in the womb, but Job is also using the exact same phraseology, but that's kind of a God shaping us in a completely different way, not necessarily from the dust. But when we're talking about dust, the word here is from basically particulate matter. If you're thinking of actual dust, like if you're kicking up dust, that's what's being meant, is that it's not hard and fast earth, but something that you can actually draw from it. The dust of the ground is also an important thing because this is the particulates of the earth. The word behind ground there is actually the word Adamah, the generic term for earth, also related to Adam. Adam is humanity from the earth. So literally we're earthy.
And it's not ashes, it's dust.
No, it's dust.
Of the earth. Some
Yeah.
people say ash to ash, no, it's dust
No,
to
dust
dust.
is dust.
Yeah, there is one verse with ash to ash, but putting dust to dust and ash to ash together is a liturgical thing.
But
Yeah.
ash is a product of burning something.
Yep.
And dust is not, so there's
No.
a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I'll save it for.
It might be different.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just semantics. Basically, yeah, you have something very, very earthy in that sense, where you have the dust, which is particulate matter. So if you break the body down to its bare components, well, you have carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, all those lovely things. And yeah, so those are just the basic elements that you find pretty much anywhere. So we're earthy. And God also breathed into the nostrils of this man the form that, so this is a body capable of life, but not actually living. Yeah. So God breathed into that. So the breath that God breathed in, the word for breath is basically synonymous with spirit. It's used one time of God's personal spirit in Job, but usually when you use this particular word in Hebrew, it refers to spirit in general. So God puts the spirit into us, specifically the spirit of life. So a living spirit into us. So the spirit is that which lives within. So this is a very abstract concept.
So then literal breath is not what's even intended,
Nope,
right? So again, doesn't even apply.
nope.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, so again, that's why I would say it's an abuse of the verse if you try to force it that.
Misconstrued.
Yeah.
For sure.
And then at the end, the man became a living being. That will be translated differently. The word for being there, nefesh, is soul, the word that we would use for soul. So a soul is that which lives in us. You could even say that when you take the body, the earthiness, you take the spirit, which is of God, and you put them together, then you get a soul. Again, that's also a huge debate within Christian theology. Is the soul something completely different, a third entity, or is it a composition, or is it just another word for spirit? I'm more of the opinion that it's a third thing and that it would actually be closer to the body with the spirit. But again, this is a matter of debate and also a matter of linguistics.
So if you no longer have a body,
Mhm.
you no longer have a soul.
And that would be one of the interesting things with the linguistics, because it's not as consistent as we might like it to be in the New Testament, because if you have the spirit leaving the body or the soul leaving the body, sometimes it's actually said as soul leaving the body. But that's interesting to think about when sometimes spirit and soul are not seen to be synonymous in other biblical texts. So it's always useful to remind ourselves the Bible is not meant to be a strict taxonomy where we have absolutely defined categories for every single thing. Yeah. So it's always look at the context. Always look at the context in which these things appear.
So you just said you consider soul and body is one.
The soul to be the enlivened, the inspirited part of the body.
So did you not just say you have the tendency to think of body and soul together? And
Well,
not to
well,
say
they
you
come
no longer have a
together,
body, you
yes.
no longer have a soul.
Um,
And that's
Here.
not what my understanding of
no.
death is.
Well, the Venn diagram might actually be helpful.
A Zen?
Then,
Venn.
Then.
VENN.
Then, yeah.
So you have the body, you have the spirit, and where they interact, that's where you get. And this is more or less how I try to frame it. Again, you'd have to look at certain biblical contexts, because in certain passages, they will use the word soul in a very different way. So at times, that will not be true. Sometimes you have passages that say you're just body and spirit, others body and soul, others body, soul, and spirit. That's one of the passages in Hebrews. So this is why it's been a debate in, can we actually hard and fast say these are the components of the human being? But fundamentally, what we should recognize is, even if the concept of soul is up for debate, and it actually can be here in this section of Genesis, because even animals are said to have souls here. And we tend to think of our spirits as something a little bit beyond what animals have. Even if we take out this middle piece, we still recognize that we are fundamentally two substances, which is the earthiness and the spiritual.
So
Yeah.
this takes us off topic, but how does that connect to consciousness?
That's more or less where I would put soul.
Okay.
Because with consciousness, you get an what's usually called an interaction problem between the purely mental and abstract and the physical. Because with the physical, you can express certain concepts with information. I mean, like you have printing on here and on the computer screen here. So here is stored information, but information is not a property of the ink or the paper.
Right.
So it's something beyond what the material can provide, but it can be expressed through the material. So consciousness would be closer to something like that.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the Nicene Creed. The
Mm.
Lord maker of all things visible and invisible.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, because the visible is physical, spirit, invisible, spiritual. So yes, but as a human being, can be complex. Bottom line, body, spirit. But also, if we're talking about life in creation, we should also talk about the image of God. This does not come up too often in Scripture. It comes up here in Genesis chapter 1, also comes up explicitly Genesis chapter 9, but usually the focus is here in Genesis chapter 1. So, as it's written, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all creatures that move along the ground. In fact, the word creatures there, that's also living beings, so or living souls. So this is something above what the animals have. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So, what is the image of God?
Very simple statement.
Yeah, I've been wondering about that.
And why does he use the hour rather than?
Oh, or yeah. If you look into,
This is by himself, I guess.
oh, yeah, well, yeah, it's well, it's just God. But you'll find sometimes what's usually called the plural of majesty. So like the Queen saying we, but for Christians, when we look at the passage like this, we can say, oh, well, this seems to be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit actually acting together. So we would say it can be a plural of majesty, and it can also be a Trinitarian statement. Yeah. So as I was also reading on the image of God in here, this is Johann Gerhard, one of his commonplace books. He is the great systematic thinker in Lutheran theology. Image of God, very hard to define. He was also listing a whole bunch of church fathers and how they defined this, and eventually what Gerhard boiled everything down into. If you look at how it's used in the New Testament, and this is in Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Corinthians, so this is something that Paul deals with a little bit. Paul is talking about this not really being present in humanity. Yeah, it's kind of lost in humanity, but it's regained in faith. And how it's typically understood, or how Gerhard would phrase this, is that it's the true righteousness and holiness that we're supposed to be having. So the image of God is God's righteousness, God's holiness. So you can even say his wisdom and ability to rule. Because when it comes up here in Genesis chapter 1, God is specifically creating human beings in his image to have dominion over everything else. So the image of God, as God rules all of creation, human beings are in the creation to rule over it. You can even say that God as a creator creates us as procreators. So in the image of God, we procreate, we're fruitful and multiply. Because this is a command that he gives immediately after this in Genesis chapter 1. So the image of God is us being like God, but in creation. A part of creation rather than being above creation like God is. To be very simplistic. This is why when it comes up in Genesis chapter 9, when God is saying that everything that sheds the blood of man, its blood will be shed, God is referencing the image of God, because if something is shedding a human being's blood, you're vicariously attacking God himself. Also why the fifth commandment is so important.
How about sovereignty? So we have free will. Do we reflect the sovereignty of God in that really small way?
And if we talk about free will, we have to be very specific in our terms.
Okay, sorry. Never mind.
So, no, that's fine. It's because this is one of these great philosophical debates. Because in part, when you tell somebody we have free will, you don't necessarily know if they are thinking the same thing. So in order for our will to be completely free, it would actually be in complete conformity with God.
Right.
Yeah. So it's we're free from all the things that would prohibit us from doing something wrong. Which is why when Luther talks about this in the bondage of the will, he's saying that our will is bound, like post-fall, because we can't help ourselves from sinning. We may be able to do certain things, like say, we're free to pick the color of our socks. That's not really a big deal. But if we're trying to talk about matters of salvation, we can't choose that. God actually has to bring us up. Yeah. So we have some freedom in a sense, but we're bound by sin. for, this is what I want to say, free will. Probably really good to define terms. Because I was even talking with somebody a few days ago, and they're using the term freedom. And I wasn't too sure how he was using that until I heard him speak. And libertarian freedom, which is basically freedom within certain boundaries. What this is talking about is autonomic freedom. So you have the autonomy in order to do what you want to do. Yeah.
Okay.
And in a sense, this is also what Adam actually had. Adam and Eve both have. Because otherwise, how could they freely choose to sin?
That's right.
Otherwise, God would have to say, sin now, in which case God now becomes the author of all, or if not the author, the source of all evil.
So then they had sovereignty and free will before the fall, and that's how
Yep.
God made them in his image.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we lost a bit of that image then once we fell.
Yep.
Okay.
A better way to phrase it might actually be the image of God is marred or scarred.
Okay.
It's broken. Yeah. So insofar as we have been brought to life in faith, yeah, the image of God is kind of being reconstructed in us, but all the breakage points are still there. So if you break a mirror and then try to put it back together, you'll have all those cracks in there. You'll have the mirror,
Yeah.
but it won't be quite the same.
Right.
So we're waiting for the time when our image is melted down and recast. Yeah. Metaphors are nice.
Yeah, they are, especially in mirror. So the image of God is a spiritual thing. It's not nothing physical, right? It's not a literal.
No,
image.
yeah, it's not a physical thing. Otherwise, we could, because that's also one of the issues in the history of the church, where people say, well, it's rationality, and maybe just leave it at that. Because, well, then you could say, well, everybody has rationality, even some animals are rational in some respects. So how does that make us different?
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on. So since we established who we are, body, spirit with the image of God, death. Woohoo. So what causes death? And I have a few verses there. The first one, which is very pertinent to the Garden of Eden, the creation, Genesis 2:16-17. So God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Explicitly linked to a command from God. And this is actually the first mention of death in the Bible. It's a deviation from God's will. So when we get to much later passages such as Ezekiel and Romans, where we see, well, the soul that sins is the soul that dies, the wages of sin is death. Death is always tied to sin. This is never a good thing. Death is never seen as a good thing, but it's always resulting from something bad.
But Adam and Eve wouldn't know what death is. And then they've never seen it anyway.
Yeah, I would say it's the difference between having a knowledge about something and having experience of it.
Yeah, okay.
Because they can kind of conceive of what death could be, as I'm going to get into that within the next little bit. They can kind of conceive what it could be, but they really have no like deep-rooted concept. This is what it means to be dead or go into death. Yeah.
He said he never experienced it.
Yeah.
Even the foliage hasn't experienced it.
Yeah.
Well, they were running on in paradise.
Right.
They
So-
would
Oh, actually,
thought that there's no aging and no.
No, that's right. Even the foliage around them, the world around them has not experienced yet.
Yeah, that might be an interesting point, because if they're eating vegetables, because if you eat fruit, like, well, those just fall off and that's fine, don't harm the plant. But if they're eating vegetables, then you have to kill part of the plant in order to eat. But say like a carrot, you'd have to pull it up. So they might have had an idea of death that way. They could have.
You're assuming there's carrots in paradise.
Why wouldn't there be?
If I don't like carrots, so I could not be in my paradise.
Okay.
I mean, we're making assumptions.
Oh, yeah.
I know, my understanding is paradise, you might have death.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, yeah.
They now, they do not, they know that there is such a thing as death because they were told, but they have not experienced it.
Yeah,
Or have
yeah.
seen it or witnessed it or.
So they have not an idea of non-existence though? They know that they didn't always exist. So that death may, the idea of death may not be something that they'd be familiar, but they know that they have non-existence. I'm not sure.
Well, I guess the question is, like, do we have a good idea of what non-existence is?
Well, no, but it's intuitive,
Yeah.
and they might have had an intuition of something non-existing. I don't know.
Mhm.
We don't know whether there were seasons in paradise like the apple.
Right.
Yeah.
Did they see it grow or
Yeah.
always apple?
Yeah.
Well, it also kind of matters how long they were in paradise, because the fall could have happened on day 7.
Right.
That would be a pretty fast season. When I was looking at that a while ago, like I was trying to think through like when could this actually happen, and the two that's kind of borderline when the fall could have happened is the conception of Cain, and then also the finishing of creation day 7. So anytime in there could have been the fall. So it could have taken years, but we don't know. But also, yeah, interesting enough, plants are technically not considered alive in the Hebrew Bible, because what's actually alive are the souls, and only animals have souls. So you can eat plants.
That brings up the question when the two sons were fighting.
Yeah.
And when the king killed Adam, he know that the action would result in something called death. If they hadn't seen death before, he may not even be aware of it.
Oh, they would have seen death at that point.
Yeah, because the fall had taken place.
Yeah. So the first actual death in creation was when God slaughtered animals to clothe Adam and Eve with animal skins as they exited.
Oh, okay.
And the reason why Cain was attacking Abel was because Abel sacrificed a lamb.
Right, right.
So they would have had that
Yeah,
type of
yeah.
conception, yeah, at that time. Yeah, interesting. We're kind of looking at, so causing the death is basically that which is nothing good. But what is death? And I pulled here a few verses that help us think about it. So Genesis 3:19c. So this is the end of God's curse against Adam. He says, "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." So something fairly familiar. This decomposition of the body. Ecclesiastes 12:7 deals a bit more with the spiritual side of it. So, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I wanted to highlight that with, well, Jesus dying on the cross. Well, how could he die? And in John 19 there, when Jesus had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
Which goes up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although there's also an interesting passage earlier on in Ecclesiastes that's in chapter 3, where Gehelith, the guy who's speaking all this, he mused, well, does man's spirit go up when the spirits of animals go down into the dust? So if you think about, say, Sheol, the land of the dead, like, is it possible for unbelievers, people who are not in the faith, like the spirit wouldn't necessarily go to God in the sense that it would be received by him in paradise. So would it remain in the world, or conceptually the underworld, which is what Sheol is? Interesting. But Ecclesiastes chapter 3 just puts it as a possibility. It doesn't actually say yay or nay. So interesting. Oh, absolutely. Well, this is spirit. How are we going to test a spirit?
The very first verse here about Jesus giving up the spirit. So that phase must have been known to people by that time. That there is a spirit that goes up.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, because fundamentally, what we see here is that death is the separation of the body and spirit.
And the spirit returns to God.
Yeah.
So whether it goes up or down, it doesn't matter, it goes to God.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And in this sense, because if you're looking at, well, you're dividing the body and the spirit, and now the body from dust you are to dust you return is turning into dust, it's decomposing. You can actually say that death is uncreation or decreation. Because God, when he created Adam, he formed the dust, breathed spirit into it. So in death, we receive a reversal of that. The spirit comes out and then the body turns to dust. So it's going in the opposite direction creation should. Yeah, so you can say that, yeah, death is not a good thing in and of itself, because if creation, God says at the end of the 7 days, it is very good, everything is created is very good. If something is being brought out of creation, that would, by logical reasoning, be bad, wickedness. So death in and of itself is not a good thing. It's actually kind of the opposite. It's not descriptive of creation whatsoever. It's being deprived of creation.
For somebody suffering slow, debilitating, death is a good thing, or could be conceived as being.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and that's what we're going to get into.
yeah, that's what we, yeah.
Because even with people committing suicide, maybe they're not conceiving of physical pain, maybe it's mental or social issues. People who consider suicide, they're seeking a way to escape. Like this is not, death is not necessarily seen as a good thing, but it's an escape. Yeah. Or avoidance of suffering. But kind of going back to the soul that sins is the soul that dies, that says the Lord. You can say that God has two wills, as it were. There's what we call the anteceded will, so the will that goes before, and this is the will that defines creation. This is all that's good and blessed and lovely. This is what God wants for us. This is his primary goal when it comes to humanity and even the rest of creation. He wants us to receive good. But there's also a consequent will, where God will punish sin with death. So he will bring something out of creation. So he wants to give us the blessings of creation, but if we're sinning and messing up creation, he'll take us out.
Well, the Lord gives and takes away, you know.
Yes. Thus said Job when he was lying in the dust contemplating his own death.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking of a relative I had in Germany who was suffering from one particular disease for years, and all she was saying, if I could only die.
Mm.
And she was very Christian, and of course she would never have done anything to speed death, but now you have this option of what we call assisted death, you know?
Mhm.
Is that still, or is it an option for Christians? Under those circumstances?
Short answer, no. Longer answer, we'll deal with that in future sessions.
Different phases.
But yeah, it's because I've actually been in that situation too, talking to somebody who says I want to die, but I know Jesus won't let me.
Well,
Like if somebody's asking their pastor, is it all right if I die, if I take this medication and die? They're not doing it flippantly. They're actually in a lot of pain. So all of these issues need to be dealt with understanding and a lot of care.
I have what they call a living will, which is authorizing my power of attorney that if I'm incurably sick, they should not try and prolong my life. So that's a different way of looking
Yes,
at it.
that's very different.
Nobody's doing any killing. It's just, you know, in other words, let nature take its course.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, and we'll also, I'll hopefully also try to address that, because there's other ways you can understand it. Because because there's been certain people with, well, the medical assistance in dying, the laws in Canada will allow you, if you have a prolonged illness and you deem the treatments unbearable, you could actually elect yourself for death. So theoretically, as the law becomes more, I want to say liberal, but that's not the best word for it. But
Inclusive, so including other.
Yeah.
Accepted.
Yeah. Then you could actually elect, I say like, oh, well, I have this completely treatable illness that I can go into dialysis every week for the two days a week for the rest of my life, but I don't want to do that, so just kill me now.
yeah, but there's a difference between you saying, I don't want any more treatment, and somebody is saying, oh, go ahead and kill me now.
Yeah, there is. There's a big difference.
To me, that's the dividing line.
It is.
So both of them are treatments.
Hmm?
Well, dialysis is a treatment.
Yes.
Yes.
And if you can refuse that treatment,
But I mean.
Yeah, and that's one of the sticky
you
situations.
can refuse that treatment.
Yeah, but yeah, it's completely treatable, but it's, are you within your rights to treat this, to refuse treatment and die, even though it's completely treatable?
Did you quit dialysis?
Yeah.
I was actually in the situation.
Really?
My father had refused dialysis for 9 days. And I got a call and flew to the Maritimes, right?
Oh, boy.
Because he was not expected to live.
Yeah.
Right? And faced my dad. And he said, well, what do you think? And I said, what do you mean? What do I think? I'm here for you because you're going to die.
Yeah.
He said, what? He said, I can't die. I've got things for you to do. Oh, no. And I said, well, if you can't die, then you need to take dialysis. And the next morning he took it.
Yeah.
So of course, the doctors came to me and said, what did you say to him? Like, we've been begging him for 9 days to take this, your mother, everybody, I had 8 brothers and sisters, right? And I said, I just told them the reality.
Yeah.
The outcome is death. And you can hold the world record on not taking dialysis, but
Oh,
he
yeah,
died.
yes.
And he had things he had to get done. Now, it only prolonged his life another 9 months.
Mhm.
Right, because he did die.
Yeah.
But he died in God's hands,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, yeah,
Not by his separate nature.
yeah, and not by
But
his
I
own
mean,
hand.
but he refused the treatment.
Yeah.
And he only had one kidney to start with,
Mm,
so it was even more imperative.
yeah, that's a bad situation. Well,
But it was that and sometimes you just have to say things like that.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah, there's, I think I have enough time to briefly tell the story. Luther was, I can't remember exactly what happened. I think it was the death of one of his great friends, or he was just incredibly depressed, and he was going around loafing about his house for certain periods of time. And then one day he saw his wife, Katie Luther, dressed in mourning clothes.
Mhm.
And like this kind of shocked him out of it. He goes, "Why are you doing that?" And he's like, "Well, if you're doing what you're doing, then well, God must have died. So I'm mourning." And then that kind of shocked him out of it. But sometimes you need extraordinary measures.
And fast forward, I had a brother ended up in the same situation. My brother ended up in the same situation. He had to take dialysis, and he took it for 4 years before he had a kidney transplant.
Okay.
So, right, but I mean, yeah, big difference.
Okay.
But he accepted the treatment, but in May, you can refuse the treatment, like you said, it's a living will. You don't want to take any more treatment, you don't have to.
Yeah.
Take it, right?
Okay.
My mother-in-law was about to go on dialysis and she absolutely did not want to. And she died before even going on dialysis. In some ways, like God took care of her in that regard.
Right, yeah,
Yeah, too. So yeah, there's all kinds of.
Depends a
ways.
bit how old the person is. I mean, if you may be struck when you're 40, you know.
Yeah,
It's different than when you're 75, you know, what the heck, I'm
Yeah,
40, you know.
she was 72, and it's the day after her 50th anniversary, and we'd all seen her that night, and she just next day was gone.
well, my brother was 57 and my father was 72.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that gets me here, doctors are trained with the idea to keep the patient alive as long as you possibly can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
The idea that some of the patient may not want to be kept alive is something relatively new.
Well, that's also calling into question the Hippocratic Oath,
right.
which is one of the major features of the debate in recent years. You know. Quickly go through. So I have a few more. So the new life. Very briefly do this because I wanted to bring out interesting Levitical text. So I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood.
Does that mean meat or?
No, it doesn't refer to me. It just refers to the blood. So usually, what would happen is that you try to drain the blood before you consume the animal. The idea was that since life is in the blood, you can say that this is a little bit more symbolic than anything else. But since life is in the blood, if you drain the blood out of the body, like they're going to die. The Israelites were not supposed to consume the blood. You also have a whole bunch of pagan religions at this time trying to consume blood, so to gain the life and powers of the animal. So that is not for the Israelites. Life belongs to God, God alone. The Israelites cannot take it for themselves. God gives life to these things. Israelites are not supposed to take it without God's say so. So specifically, Israelites, when they're actually trying to take the blood from an animal with God's say so, they can only do that in the context of, say, consuming for their own life, for their own personal well-being. And here, in making atonement. So since life is in the blood, if you sinned, blood is shed for you, so your life is not taken. So the animal's life for your life. And in that sense, the question on the bottom there, is there a proper use of death? And if it's to save another life, then yes. And we'll be getting into this type of quandary if we do tackle, tackle abortion or even MAID, is if a doctor has to choose between one or the other patient, is the doctor now committing manslaughter? Yeah, it doesn't. I don't think you could really say that.
To think about what would Mother Nature do if there
Mhm.
was no doctor, they would both die.
Exactly.
So at least he's doing a good job. In the
I don't.
sense of
Yeah,
saving
you can
someone.
save one. You might only save one for a limited period of time, but you can at least try and save one. And also with the atonement in mind, I have there the Hebrews, because Hebrews deals a lot with Levitical law. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not part of this creation. So heavenly places. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of the heifer, sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? So there's an interesting thing happening where Jesus is not just offering blood, but blood with the Spirit of God. So it's not just that one guy hung upon the cross and now all of us are saved. It's the God-man hung upon the cross and now we're all saved. So the Spirit of God united to the blood actually gives us his Spirit. So not only are we just outwardly cleansed, like the Israelites, you sprinkled them with blood when you make the sacrifice. And then the blood was on you and then you were outwardly clean. But Jesus, you were sprinkled spiritually and inwardly, and that cleanses you from inside out. This is also why in chapter 10 of Hebrews, the author will say, it is impossible for the blood of animals to take away sins, because you're cleansing people outwardly and you need to continuously do that. You're never actually fixing the real problem, which is the heart. So that's why Christ gives this deal. And we're slightly over time, so I'll finish this. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So even in addition to that, trying to tie this back to creation itself. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. So Genesis 2:7. The last Adam, or the last man, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth, the second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth, and as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. So through Christ, you were brought back into the goodness of creation and also the image of God, even though you're suffering from sin and getting closer to death. And with this, I would also like to tack on an extra thing, because the question now becomes, who is our neighbor? Like, who are we trying to help? Who is the one who is receiving this? And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, somebody asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor that I should love him as myself? So who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. You have two guys pass by this person robbed and beaten on the road. Then you have the Samaritan, this guy who's not even a Jew. Well, he takes this guy up, he sets him up in a good hotel. He says, "Oh, I'll take care of the bill, no worries," and basically cares for this person's life more than the other two guys. So at the end of the parable, Jesus asks, "Well, who was a neighbor to this man?" And the reply was, "The one who showed him mercy." And if we're actually thinking through this, when Jesus asks, "Well, who is a neighbor to this guy?" It's not asking, well, it's not answering who is my neighbor in a direct way, but what Jesus is meaning is, who is your neighbor? Anyone to whom you can show mercy.
And not even of your own kind. I find it
Yes.
so significant that it was the Samaritan and not a Jew.
Yes.
That's a bit of a.
Yeah. I had a visiting professor at the seminary say, like, well, you could try and retell the parable of the Good Samaritan as the parable of the good Muslim who shows up all the Christians who are supposed to love your neighbor. Because that's basically what this is. But yeah, so since it's anyone who can be shown mercy, this means that your neighbor is anyone to whom you can actually advocate on to try and say, well, don't kill yourself for somebody else. So with any end of life issue, whether it be like suicide, medically assisted suicide, so you can even talk to the physician, or abortion, so talking to parents or giving consent, you actually do have this obligation, God-given obligation, to try and help somebody. And likewise, anyone who can receive the message of the gospel, even those who are unborn and still need to hear the message, even though they're in the womb, they are your neighbors to whom you can give the gospel, so that not only are you trying to save their physical life, you can try and give them spiritual life through the gospel. Well, I'll end myself there. Any other thoughts or comments or questions?
Well, and it says here, you shall not murder / kill. Last week we were talking about the difference between murder and kill.
Yeah, we don't have enough time for me to go through the whole thing.
Okay.
We'll do that next time.
So can we talk a minute about having this on Thursday night as opposed to Sunday afternoon?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I just went with what was on the questionnaire. So I also didn't know who was going to show up or if people would be interested in actually having it on Thursdays. So if you want to change it, you can certainly decide that.
I was happy the way it was, but that all depends on transportation. But I'm also saying